Zen tells you to see your nature, and if you want to understand what that actually means, you need to go somewhere most introductions to Zen never take you. Not deeper into Zen itself, but backward, into the Buddhist world that made that instruction possible in the first place. That's what this video is about, and by the end of it, some of the most familiar Zen expressions will look very different. But start with the phrase itself. 3 words. They sound like something you could attempt this afternoon. Sit quietly, look inward, find whatever is essentially you. The problem appears the moment you ask what kind of nature Buddhism could possibly mean. Is it your personality? A permanent witness behind thought? A soul that survives the body? Or something that doesn't fit any of those categories at all? That question is not new. It was already being argued in monasteries and translation halls centuries before the phrase became famous. And that's where this investigation begins. Not with a definition, but with the problem hidden inside an instruction most people have heard, and very few have actually examined. Zen is a Buddhist tradition. That sounds obvious, but it matters more than it first appears. The word Zen is Japanese, derived from the Chinese Chan, which itself comes from the Sanskrit dhyana, a term for meditative stillness that runs through Buddhist practice from its earliest recorded forms. Zen didn't begin in Japan. It began as a current inside Mahayana Buddhism in China, in a world already shaped by centuries of translated scriptures, doctrinal debates, and competing schools of Buddhist thought. When Chan teachers spoke about awakening, about mind, about original nature, they were speaking a language they had inherited. They were answering questions that Buddhist thinkers had been asking long before any Chinese master wrote a single line. One of the most important of those questions is still alive in the phrase, "you know." The Platform Sutra, one of the earliest and most influential Chan texts, associated with Huineng, the figure tradition calls the 6th patriarch, places seeing one's nature, Jianxing, at the very center of what sudden awakening means. Scholars note that its biography of Huineng is more literary than historical, a construction of the tradition rather than a documentary record. But the teaching itself is explicit. Awakening is not receiving something from outside, not accumulating doctrine, but a direct realization of one's own nature, which returns you immediately to the problem. What is this nature that can be directly realized? Buddhism had already rejected the idea of a permanent individual self, a fixed soul, unchanged beneath thought and experience. That teaching, no self, is foundational. And yet here is Chan, the tradition that flows into what you now call Zen, speaking openly about realizing your true nature, your original mind. Something is going on beneath that language that cannot be explained by personality theory or Western ideas about the soul. The Buddhist traditions feeding into Chan had already worked for centuries on a question that makes see your nature far more interesting than it first appears. If a mind is genuinely deluded and afflicted, how can awakening be possible at all? Not eventually possible in some abstract future, possible for this mind, starting here, perhaps even suddenly. Something in the understanding of mind, of what is obscured, and what might already be luminous beneath the obscuration, had to be worked out before anyone could teach it. Before Chan masters could speak about seeing an original nature, Mahayana Buddhists had already been trying to explain how a mind covered by ignorance could nonetheless wake up. That earlier argument is where this investigation goes next. Long before the famous Chan masters, Mahayana Buddhism was already wrestling with the question Zen would later compress into a few unsettling words. The wrestling began with a safeguard. The teaching known as emptiness was not, as it is sometimes misread, a claim that nothing exists. Madhyamaka philosophy used emptiness to deny that things, including the self, possess some fixed, independent nature of their own. It rejected two errors at once: the idea that the self is an eternal substance, and the idea that it simply vanishes into nothingness at death. Neither extreme captures what is actually happening. That careful middle position was the ground on which everything else had to be built. Yogacara added another layer. This school developed some of the most sophisticated accounts of consciousness in the Buddhist tradition, detailed models of how perception, habit, and mental states arise and sustain themselves. And yet even here, the tradition was careful. However complex the account of mind, there was no permanent substantial owner underneath it all. No unchanging experiencer watching from behind the stream of thought. So far, this might sound like a philosophy of careful negation. But then something unexpected appears in the sources. Certain Mahayana texts describe the nature of mind not through denial alone, but through a different kind of language altogether. Luminous, affirmative, even warm. A mind that is, in its essential nature, pure. Not pure because it has been perfected through effort, but pure in a way that delusion obscures without destroying. One important early Mahayana text, The Great Cloud, describes this directly. The nature of mind is essentially pure, but covered by psychological defilements. The image that comes naturally here is light behind clouds, not light that has to be manufactured, but light already present, becoming visible when the obscuration thins. It is worth holding as metaphor rather than as a description of something literally glowing inside the body. This is where a teaching called tathāgatagarbha, or Buddha nature, enters the picture. It became one of the central Mahayana ways of explaining something that would otherwise seem impossible. How a mind genuinely covered by ignorance and affliction could still be capable of awakening. If the fundamental nature of mind were corrupted all the way down, awakening would have no ground to stand on. Buddha nature was the answer, or at least one answer, to that problem. But the answer created its own controversy, one that Buddhist and scholarly traditions have never entirely resolved. Because Buddha nature texts sometimes sound strikingly affirmative, speaking of purity, luminosity, even something resembling permanence. The question naturally arises whether Buddhism has quietly reintroduced what it officially rejected: an eternal self, a soul by another name. Scholars and Buddhist traditions have long debated how this language should be reconciled with emptiness and no self. What is clear is that it cannot simply be translated into the idea of an immortal personal soul. The major Mahayana interpretive traditions continued to work within emptiness and dependent conditions, even while using affirmative language about mind and awakening. So the tension holds: neither "there is a hidden soul," nor "there is simply nothing there," accurately represents what these sources are doing. That unresolved tension is exactly what traveled east, carried in texts, debated in monasteries, and eventually translated into a language and culture that would reshape it into something distinctly its own. What arrived in China was not one finished package called Buddhism. It came in stages, through texts and teachings drawn from different Indian traditions, each carrying its own language for mind, reality, practice, and awakening. You can imagine the scene less as a single doctrine being handed across a border, and more as a long translation room. Manuscripts are opened, terms are compared, monks and scholars search for Chinese words capable of carrying ideas formed in another intellectual world. Commentaries accumulate, systems are classified, and as the centuries pass, concepts that had developed in different Indian settings begin to be read beside one another. That matters because the vocabulary later inherited by Chan was never as simple as one word with one definition. Madhyamaka spoke through emptiness. Yogacara developed intricate accounts of consciousness. Buddha nature traditions asked how awakening could be possible in beings still covered by ignorance. Other frameworks spoke of suchness, storehouse consciousness, or one mind. These terms could overlap in interpretation, but they were not automatically identical. Chinese Buddhist thinkers had to decide how they related, where they differed, and whether apparently conflicting descriptions might be pointing toward the same problem from different directions. By roughly the 5th through 7th centuries, debates about mind, purity, Buddha nature, consciousness, and universal Buddhahood had become part of the established Buddhist landscape of East Asia. Chan would emerge inside that landscape. One especially influential framework was associated with the awakening of faith. It described one mind through two complementary aspects, suchness and arising and ceasing. The point was not simply to divide reality into two separate worlds. It offered a way of speaking about what is unconditioned, while still accounting for the changing, conditioned movement of ordinary experience. That kind of language became especially important in Huayan Buddhism. Huayan drew together several streams already present in Chinese Buddhism: Madhyamaka, Yogacara, the Avatamsaka Sutra, and the Awakening of Faith. From them, it developed distinctively East Asian ways of thinking about emptiness, interdependence, and mind. This was not yet Chan, and Huayan did not simply create Zen, but its ideas and vocabulary would significantly influence the Buddhist world in which Chan developed. That makes a crucial difference to how we picture the early tradition. The famous Chan master does not appear against an empty background, suddenly rejecting centuries of philosophy in favor of pure spontaneity. Behind the short sayings are generations of translation, interpretation, argument, and synthesis. And that may be the most important shift at this stage of the investigation. There was never one neat doctrine of true mind waiting for Zen to inherit. There was a network of Buddhist attempts to explain how emptiness, consciousness, purity, delusion, and awakening could belong to one path without collapsing into contradiction. Chan inherited that network. Then it began speaking in a very different voice. In the Platform Sutra, the long philosophical problem becomes startlingly direct. Awakening is no longer discussed only as a theory about mind or Buddhahood. It is presented as something much closer to an instruction: see your own nature. In the Platform Sutra, that instruction becomes one of the defining ways awakening is described. The text presents Huineng, traditionally remembered as the sixth patriarch, teaching that realization is not something handed to you from outside. It is a matter of seeing your own nature. The Chinese expression is jian xing, seeing nature, and beside it stands another important term, dunwu, sudden awakening. Together, they change the tone of the older Mahayana problem. What had been discussed through ideas like Buddha nature, purity, consciousness, and suchness now becomes immediate. Not build a new nature, not receive enlightenment from somewhere else. See what is already there to be realized. But that does not mean the Platform Sutra is inviting you to uncover a hidden personality beneath your social roles. Its language belongs to a Buddhist path of awakening. The text connects Buddha nature with meditation and wisdom, and with a formless approach to practice. Seeing your nature is therefore not psychological self-discovery in the modern sense. It concerns liberation from delusion and a transformation in how reality is understood. This is also where a historical caution becomes important. The Platform Sutra is a genuine and enormously influential Chan text, and the teachings it preserves became central to the tradition. But the famous story surrounding Huineng should not be treated like a modern eyewitness transcript. The text presents Huineng as teaching these ideas, although modern scholars caution that its celebrated biography is partly a literary and hagiographic construction rather than a verbatim historical record. That distinction does not make the text unimportant. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. The Platform Sutra shows us how an early Chan community wanted awakening, authority, practice, and lineage to be understood. And one of the strongest ideas in that presentation is suddenness. Later Chan tradition became famous for contrasting a gradual northern school with a sudden southern school associated with Huineng. The opposition mattered. Sudden and gradual awakening became powerful terms in later Chan discussion. But the clean division is too simple if we treat it as an exact map of early Chan history. Historians regard that sharp two-school contrast as partly polemical, and surviving Buddhist traditions reveal more complicated relationships between immediate insight and continued cultivation. That complication matters because the word sudden can easily mislead you. If awakening means seeing Buddha nature directly, and if that recognition can happen suddenly, then an obvious question follows. Why practice at all? Why meditate, cultivate wisdom, or work with deeply rooted habits if your nature can be recognized in an instant? The Platform Sutra does not solve that question by dismissing practice. Its concern with meditation, wisdom, and formless practice already prevents such an easy conclusion, and its emphasis on direct realization should not be confused with hostility toward Buddhist teaching itself. Chan often warned against becoming trapped in concepts, mistaking words about awakening for awakening itself. But that is very different from saying words, scriptures, and teachings never mattered. The tension is becoming sharper now. Awakening is described as seeing what is already your own nature. It can be sudden. It is not bestowed from outside. And yet delusion, practice, and transformation have not disappeared. In 8th century Chan, sayings associated with Mazu Daoyi push that tension even further. This mind is Buddha. And then, more provocatively, ordinary mind is the way. Those two sayings sound simple enough to become dangerous. If this mind is Buddha and ordinary mind is the way, then what stops Zen from meaning that whatever you already think, feel, prefer, or do is somehow enlightened? That is not the setting in which Mazu Daoyi's teachings developed. Mazu belongs to 8th century Chinese Chan, and sayings associated with him sit inside the same Buddhist world we have already traced, a world concerned with Buddha nature, delusion, awakening, non-attachment, and direct realization. In later East Asian Chan and San interpretation, Buddha nature could be spoken of not only as a future capacity to become a Buddha, but as the true or fundamental mind to be directly realized. That helps explain why a phrase like, "This mind is Buddha," could become possible. It is not necessary to hear it as a claim that some immortal consciousness is hiding inside you. But neither is it simply saying that the confused mind, exactly as it functions in every moment, needs no transformation. The same caution applies to ordinary mind is the way. Taken out of its Buddhist setting, the phrase can sound like permission to bless every habit. Anger is ordinary, craving is ordinary, distraction is ordinary, so perhaps nothing needs to change. But the tradition surrounding the saying is still concerned with delusion and realization. Ordinary does not automatically mean every conditioned reaction is enlightened, simply because it happens naturally. The phrase belongs to a path that also speaks about non-attachment and seeing through the ways the mind becomes caught. This is one reason Zen sayings can become misleading when they are separated from the tradition that produced them. Their brevity is powerful because a great deal is left unstated. A few words could land in a monastery where Buddhist practice, scripture, discipline, and debate were already part of the background. The saying did not need to carry that entire world inside every sentence. Later readers do not always have that background, and this helped create another popular picture of Zen, the idea that Chan rejected scriptures and Buddhist doctrine altogether, replacing them with pure, spontaneous experience. There is a reason that image became attractive. Chan repeatedly warned against attachment to language. It emphasized direct realization rather than merely collecting concepts about awakening. A person can memorize teachings about water and still remain thirsty. But that criticism of words is not the same as a rejection of Buddhist teaching. Zen often warned against mistaking words for awakening, but this did not mean that Chan historically existed without Buddhist scriptures or doctrine. Chan communities produced, quoted, transmitted, commented on, and reinterpreted Buddhist texts. The irony is visible in front of us. The Platform Sutra, one of the great expressions of Chan's emphasis on direct realization, is itself a Buddhist scripture. So beyond words does not mean without a Buddhist world. It means that explanation and realization are not identical. That distinction brings the two Mazu sayings into sharper focus. "This mind is Buddha" can point toward direct realization of what Chan understood through Buddha nature. "Ordinary mind is the way" can loosen the urge to search for awakening somewhere remote or artificial. But neither saying erases delusion. And neither one answers the problem created by sudden awakening. If Buddha nature is already present, and if it can be recognized directly, perhaps even suddenly, then one question still remains. Why would anything need to be cultivated afterward? Later Korean Son gives one of the clearest answers. Chinul grounded his meditation system in Buddha nature theory. Awakening could mean directly realizing one's true nature without implying that every habit and conditioned reaction vanished at once. This is where sudden awakening and gradual cultivation meet. Chinul described mind as void and calm, yet aware. Emptiness remained essential, but so did an affirmative account of awakened awareness. He also used expressions translated as original face, linking them with original enlightenment and true mind. The key is that sudden did not mean finished. In Chinul's system, sudden enlightenment is the realization of Buddha nature. Gradual cultivation follows because persistent habits and defilements can remain. Think of a bell struck once. The sound begins instantly, but the resonance continues. Recognition can be immediate, while transformation unfolds over time. This also helps dissolve the supposed conflict between meditation and doctrine. Later San could harmonize Chan practice with Huayan teaching. Direct realization did not require rejecting Buddhist thought, and Buddhist thought did not replace direct realization. Now the familiar Zen phrases sound different. See your nature, original mind, ordinary mind, original face. This mind is Buddha, sudden awakening. They are not identical terms, and different Chan, Son, and Japanese Zen traditions did not define them in exactly the same way. Japanese Zen later developed multiple schools and approaches, so no single formula should be imposed on the entire tradition. But these expressions belong to a related Buddhist world. They become clearer when heard against the older Mahayana tension between emptiness and Buddha nature, no self and affirmative language about mind, present delusion and the possibility of awakening. Without that background, true nature can sound like a soul. Emptiness can sound like nothingness. Ordinary mind can sound like permission to remain unchanged. Sudden awakening can sound like the end of practice. And beyond words can sound like a rejection of Buddhist teaching. Placed back inside their tradition, those meanings shift. Buddha nature does not explain every Zen school or teaching, but it gives you one crucial key to Zen language about mind, nature, and awakening. So when you hear, "see your nature again," it no longer sounds like an invitation to discover some hidden object inside yourself. It sounds like the compressed form of a much older Buddhist question. How can a being be empty of any permanent self, yet capable of awakening? How can the mind be obscured, yet not defined by its obscurations? How can realization be sudden, while transformation continues? Zen inherited those questions, Then it learned to ask them in a few quiet words,